Welcome back. We are now here for Plenary Session 2, and it's time to hear back from the facilitators of the sessions before and after lunch, how we put into action the discussions from the previous sessions. So now I invite Dr. Mike Allen, New Zealand Special Envoy, to lead these discussions. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mac, and thank you, everyone. I appreciate that the All Blacks are a hell of a lot better looking than I am, but they still will be there later, I'm told. So if we get through, you'll get even more time to watch them, and the drinks will be even tastier. My privilege to try to bring together a wrap-up for the day. I'm not going to do that on my own. I've got the 5 facilitators here, and I'm going to ask them each to run through a quick summary of their sessions. Then we have a number of people who've asked for interventions from the floor, representing some of the multilateral banks and others, and so I'll be turning to them, and there may be an opportunity for questions after that, but as you appreciate, we're running a little late due to the fire alarm, and the Minister and others have commitments, so we need to be out of here by about 10 to 4 and allow the Minister and the Commissioner to come back, so if you could bear with us. So the 5 speakers are going to be firstly Patrick Brocky, who's the Head of Loans and Specialised Finance for the ANZ, then Gavin Murray, who's the resident rep in Papua New Guinea for IFC. Anthony Maxwell will follow. He's the Senior Energy Specialist for the Pacific Division from the Asian Development Bank. Simon McKenzie, the CEO of Vector Limited, will then speak. And finally, Pierre Amalat, who is the Director for Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, Gulf and the Pacific, will speak on his session. So, Patrick, I'll ask you to go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mike. Hope you can hear me okay. Good. Just 4 key themes I was going to cover, but clearly what was coming out of the session we had involving the private sector was that there's a lot to be done across the Pacific. I guess that's fairly obvious, but some of the renewable targets mean for many countries that involving the private sector is almost mandatory, and will have to be increasingly the case to achieve those targets. So they're quite ambitious targets, as we know, but ones to be applauded nonetheless. So we had 3 countries represented on the panel that I was facilitating: Samoa, Fiji and Tonga, and we had some really good feedback from Paul, Tilly and Robert in that respect about some of the things that they've been doing. There's definitely countries at different stages in terms of their processes, documentation, concessions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The first one I wanted to start off with which is almost the counterfactual, if you like, with renewable, and that's the diesel pricing. And I thought that Robert made a really good point that actually when you think about the cycle, because it was my natural assumption that the current diesel price would put off renewable energy, certainly the excuse would be there, cost of panels declining, diesel prices coming down. But he made a very good point that actually the comparative for renewable energy is being looked at a very competitive time in the marketplace. So in actual fact, if renewable energy can be competitive with the current diesel pricing, it's probably going to be competitive for quite a long time. And I think that that's a really good point. So certainly he did not see the current diesel price as a deterrent or a reason for a delay. And of course you do have the construction period, as we know, which anywhere from 12 to 24 months, and who knows where the diesel price will be at that point. I think the other comment was, when you do get, I think it's less the electric power boards, but perhaps if you're in the government, you could think about delaying things for the reasons I pointed out. But the reality is, as we've heard from all the speakers, that they have quite a long list of needs, anywhere from 25 million to 50 million US dollars a year, depending on how many megawatts you have, and so spreading it out, making a decision on the first 2-3 megawatt project, you've got to look at it in light of the overall demand and need that they have over the next 5, or in the case of one country through to 2030, you're talking about 14 years. So even if some projects end up being cheaper, and it's well known that renewable energy will probably only get cheaper, but you can't defer it forever and a day. So staggering it and spreading that over time makes sense. So we talked about the diesel pricing, that was the first thing. Second thing would be a lot of discussion around documentation and standard documentation templates Again, some countries are quite well advanced. We heard from Paul Bailey that Fiji has its own, now it's PPP, Public-Private Partnership Act, just came into legislation this year. Different countries have already got PPAs, implementation agreements, O&M contracts. I met the gentleman from UAE last night who talked about all the standard EPC contracts they've put in place for some of their concessional money or grants, and that they think they've developed a very good template. So there's a lot of good practice in the region. I think possibly what we could do better is sharing that best practice and ensuring that it gets across the region. And as Muriel on our panel talked about, it's ensuring the documentation is balanced. I think there can be a natural bias that the documentation came from a Western party, that maybe it's biased towards the investor. Documentation produced locally in country might favour the utility. We do need documentation which is balanced. Again, there's a long history of IPPs, long history. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can have balanced documentation because there are hundreds of projects, literally thousands of projects financed around the world that are balanced, and we have good people with good experience to help us achieve that. Probably the one thing I'd throw back at the development agencies and multilaterals is perhaps support for the countries in coming up with a fair set of documentation. I think one of our panel made a point about having good advisors. You need international advisors to advise the government to prepare a set of documentation that works, or a concession agreement, whatever it might be that's required. I think there are things we could do better there. Again, transparency around documentation that's being used in the region, getting the best templates that are fair, but perhaps also assisting the Pacific countries with international advisors of repute and with the right credentials to assist them and guide them when negotiating these with international parties who perhaps have been doing it for longer. The third point probably links on a little bit. We talked about the tender, or Muriel talked about the tender approach. I think that leads in from the documentation point. Talked about reverse auctions, negotiated PPAs relative to an auction, and that does come back to the size and scale of the projects. Scale is very relevant. That was talked about a lot, talking about a very small 1 megawatt project versus a 10 megawatt, and is it one shoe fits all approach, and also in terms of documentation, although typically as a banker I found project finance light approaches are quite hard to do. But there's probably something in that we could perhaps adjust the degree of documentation for the smaller projects. One shoe doesn't fit all, but also the tender approaches, where I think we also could share best practice across the region, what's worked well, standard set of tender documents and so on, including, as I mentioned earlier, the implementation agreement and so on. Transparency around investor returns was also talked about. I like the one that came up just recently about, there was offered a 20% return in the first 5 years. It was Cook's, I think. 20% return in the first 5 years. 20% might seem high, but then staggered step down subsequently. But it got the project up and running. The fourth point, and last one I want to raise, is blended financing. We had Adam Bruin from EIB on a panel, and I think there's common sense perhaps in a graduated process. I think if you go cold turkey to, I'm shooting myself in the foot here a little bit, but if you go cold turkey with commercial financing with normal commercial terms, as you would have in New Zealand, is that going to be too much of an adjustment? Will they have too much of an impact on the tariff? These are all yet to be seen. I'm a big believer in local currency financing, as some of you may know, because of what happened in Asia in the late 90s, for those who can remember it well, and I do. I think that some graduated approach involving the multilats development agencies with the commercial banks makes a lot of sense. Adam talked about first loss facilities, agency support for certain political risks. We talked about the implementation agreement, where there isn't a government guarantee, in terms of covering things like land use rights, taxes, and so on. There's quite a long list of those important elements for investors and for banks. But I do believe this blended financing approach might have some merit in going forward, and I look forward to talking more about that as a way of adjusting the process over time, because we are certainly, the donor money is not going to be here forever, and we need to be trying to establish a framework post that grant money being available.
Pat, thank you. Pat, thank you very much indeed. Gavin, look forward to hearing your comments on your access to electricity discussion.
Try this one.
A gentle push, maybe.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. So I facilitated the second breakout, which was access to electricity. We had a panel representing with representatives from the World Bank, Kamlesh, Vanuatu Department of Energy, and Christopher, the Solomon's Power, or Solomon Islands Electricity Authority, Hemant. We had a representative from Mazda UAE and the Pacific Partnership Fund in Bodhi, and Jennifer from IRENA. So we had quite a broad mix, and that actually worked out quite well in terms of complementing each other. I've tried to pull this together in terms of what were the key challenges that were identified, what were the key achievements, and then what were the key opportunities going forward. I think in terms of the challenges, the access challenge was really summarised as a Melanesian challenge right now, that the Melanesian countries are the countries that still have the lowest access to electricity rates in the Pacific, and in fact in comparable terms in some of the lowest in the world. But more specifically, the challenges were clearly the ones that I think we've already all identified, but the tyranny of distance. In Vanuatu, you have 83 islands. Some of those islands have population of less than 10,000 people, and you're expected to provide power to those communities. And then that relates directly into the economies of scale of being able to make things work at a practical level. And then the third challenge, which I think we've heard constantly throughout the day, but is the vulnerability to the cost of diesel and the impact that has on the economies more broadly. In terms of achievements, there were a number of things identified as great successes already. I think the first of those was progress in planning. Certainly there seems to be a much more comprehensive approach to identifying what the priorities are and where the gaps are that need to be addressed, and then getting agreement on how to address those. The second was in terms of implementing and funding some small-scale hybrid solutions. It's happening now, and it seems to be working. And then thirdly, new collaborations in terms of delivering joint support on those priorities, so across different groups and with different interests, but coming together to actually make something happen in a country. In terms of the opportunity side, I think we tried to delve a little bit into the private sector challenge, and I think it was identified as really having to move from thinking about private sector interventions around EPC contracts and public procurement through to actually leveraging private sector innovation and coming up with new solutions, and in what ways could we incentivise that. I think the whole issue of standardisation of approach and bundling of projects to get scale was seen as one way of trying to simplify access to a market for players who may not want to necessarily see a small country as being a big opportunity for them, but if they can actually get enough scale and replicate what they're doing elsewhere on a standardised way, it actually makes that more attractive. And the third is actually thinking about how to leverage the use of the donor resources more effectively, and perhaps through trying to design what is commercially practical, and then identifying what is the viability gap and using the donor resources to fund that viability gap to drive a commercial outcome. And then thinking about things on a portfolio basis, and Pat just mentioned risk share facilities and first losses, and trying to use some of those interventions as a way of driving private sector finance as well, and perhaps new sources of finance. We had a couple of hot topics of discussion that came up that sort of I thought were worth highlighting. One was the issue of product standards and certification, the issue of, in some cases, the dumping of product into the Pacific that doesn't meet or wouldn't meet perhaps standards that are here or in Australia, and then the need, and I think Jennifer from IRENA highlighted that the opportunity to build those standards and certification requirements into policy and into regulation at a country level to avoid those situations. But maybe it's worth thinking about more at a regional level or building off countries that have done that successfully. Obviously, the issue of land came up again in terms of the significance of customary land and customary land expectations in being involved in a project. In a lot of these remote areas, it is all customary land, there is no state land, so you really have to deal with it at a community level, and that takes time. And then the other one, which I thought was interesting and we had a bit of discussion around, was, are we missing something? And I think the point that sort of came out of that was the need to think a little bit more creatively around disruptive business models rather than disruptive technologies. And can we look elsewhere and see what people are doing at a small scale that is working with private sector and try to bring those ideas into the Pacific. And there was a point also made about trying to reach out to the diaspora of Pacific Islanders who are now around the world, who are perhaps working in other places, have some ideas or links into new business opportunities that they could bring back. So in summary, I guess I tried to pull that together into the 4 components of access, and really it's the reality of what's happening on the ground, the political will, the regulatory environment, and the physical and social environment. The second is the doability in terms of the institutional capacity and the implementation models. The third being affordability, both in terms of how to finance the infrastructure or financing the infrastructure build that's required, but the operating business model and the customer willingness and ability to pay, which often, as we heard, is that paying the highest tariffs in the world in some of these countries. And then the fourth component of that is the sustainability, is really the sources of generation, I think the maintenance of assets, and we've heard a bit of discussion about that today, and then obviously longer term, the market competitiveness. So I'll leave it at that, Mike.
Gavin, many thanks. Anthony, would you like to discuss the innovative solutions for small island states that you chaired, please?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mike. Our panel was looking at innovative solution for small island states. We had quite a good panel. We had quite a good group of people, quite diverse. We had 2 from small utilities who were very active in converting their grids. They're getting quite high penetration. We had Stephen Walls from the Department of Energy of the US. We had Cameron Driver from the Pacific community, and we had Morel Godito from the Italian Development Corporation. So it was quite a diverse mix of people, which I think led to some quite good discussion. Small island states threw up some interesting angles, mainly because we were looking at the small grids. In some countries they might be mini grids, but these are quite important. And the discussion, I think, centred around 3 areas. The first was the innovations you get on the technical side. Secondly, innovations on the management side, and thirdly, on the financing structuring required for these small grids. So on the technical side, the panelists and the audience emphasised the difficulties, as you'd expect, in blending multiple generation technologies. Quite interestingly, the small grids that we looked at were nearing 100%, and they were actually considering how you change that last 5-10%, how you get to 100%. And in most cases, they were saying solar was their core backbone of generation, but it couldn't get you the whole way because of the battery storage issues. So they were looking at biomass and biogas in one instance as an alternative technology to get you that last mile. They all talked about the need for energy efficiency gains on the small grid, so it's not good enough just to put on generation capacity for renewable energy. You need to manage your consumption. And they talked a little bit about the demand side, management side of things as well. Grid planning was identified as being crucial and was thrown up as something that the development partners could also support. And that was in around technical support for the grid, designing the grid, but also having feasibility study level data to make your planning decisions. Without that, it's quite difficult to move ahead. Secondly, there was awareness around the need for, on one hand, work on the planning, regulatory, legislative side of the equation, and on the other hand, the hardware, the nuts and bolts. But they said they would prefer to see these projects go together and that they tended to leverage off each other. So if you had a large project on the generation side and the T&D side, that if you could do the regulatory reform at the same time, it gave them a lot of synergies. Thirdly, there was recognition around community ownership at the small scale and local ownership. Without that, these systems, these developments weren't seen as being terribly sustainable. Next, there was talk about the need for monitoring. Now, this was both from a national perspective and also a regional perspective, partly to make the development sustainable, but also partly to demonstrate your impacts if you're relying on development support to be able to say this is what we've achieved with the financing, gives you a great leg into the next step of support. Lastly, it's a bit of a theme that's run through the conference, but there was a recognition around the need for private financing and innovation around the private financing. The smaller grids, there was a recognition that they had capacity constraints, but also utility and national financing constraints. So private sector was seen as valuable from the financing it was bringing in, but also the technical capacity that it was introducing to the small island states. There was a little bit of talk about the need for public financing to leverage financing sector, but I think Gavin touched on that as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Simon, would you like to comment on your innovation around the utilities of the future? I thought it was a very interesting session.
Thanks. Yes, it was a great session, and I'd like to thank all the participants. So we had Michelle from Ergon and Michelle Taylor. We had Paul Mukumbi from Synergise, the CEO of a private perspective, investor perspective. Andrew Darker from the Pacific Power Association. Fuyaka Sagara from the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, and Steve from Tiapunga. So I guess the key features that came out from my perspective were that we're seeing a world driven now by more customised perspective, so really focused around what customers are demanding, and in that context we're seeing a move from very much a centralised model of utility planning to a decentralised model, whether that's actually in kind of large-scale incumbent utilities such as we see in New Zealand or Australia, and the relevance of that is the decentralised models that will prevail probably through a lot of the Pacific Island nations. Where that led to was really the whole kind of context around the need to meld the knowledge of technologists with utilities. So what that essentially means is we've got a lot of new entrants in the technology space needing to now learn and understand what it means to put these technologies into the utilities, and vice versa for the utilities to understand the impact of them on their systems, to not only provide more reliability solutions but also lower cost solutions to achieve better outcomes for all the customers. I guess that was put in a really good context by Andrew coining the phrase an energy cloud, and I think that really does capture the essence of what's going on with a lot of the new solutions out there. That led on to a discussion with regards to the need for the banking kind of system to really understand, and people funding into these new solutions, what the risks are with these new asset types and models, given that a number of them are relatively new, and so how does that play out with regards to the risk appetite and the way in which the banks will view the funding of the solutions being put forward by potentially the private sector, but equally relevant for the public sector. Obviously, as a number of others have commented on about the challenges with resourcing to actually deploy the technology, but also with regards to servicing the technology, and in particular the expertise that is needed, and sometimes has to be flowing in from outside of zones quite a distance to actually, fix or repair or maintain the assets, which is actually more complex than a lot of people sometimes give credit for. So that whole how do we actually service the assets when they actually are deployed is pretty critical. An interesting perspective was also that once customer confidence grows with the deployment of the new technology, so will demand grow for these technologies. So that could take off on quite a steep curve, and how do we meet that demand as more and more of the solutions get deployed. Does lead on to the fundamental question of, can regulation actually keep pace with the change of technology? From a vector perspective in particular, we see it's got a real struggle to be able to keep pace just to the rate of change. And I think going forward, the question of what role will regulation have will have to be looked at in particular, certainly in the safety and the integrity of the assets side, but with regards to the economic regulation, that's probably a big debate for another day. Fuyaka mentioned a really good point around collaboration in the sense of learning from what other economies are doing, and he gave a great example of Okinawa in Japan, where they've got lots of islands of different sizes, so there's many different solutions for different sizes and different needs, and a lot can be learnt without reinventing the deployment of solutions by engaging with other countries that have deployed that. And lastly, Steve really did a great job of summing up the conversation from all the panellists and really putting it in the whole context of these energy solutions and the utilities of the future, not only focus on, or need to focus on, the health of the utilities, but also the fundamental impact it can have into the communities with regards to the money that's avoided from spending on diesel or other energies can be deployed into bettering education and health, which I think is a great reminder for everyone in the sector. And with that, he also gave a great example of how they have some old diesel plant, but are really looking for innovation to see how that old diesel plant can actually be a test bed for trialling biofuels as another source, which kind of goes in with some of the comments about if you've got a lot of solar, how else do you supplement that? So all in all, a great discussion.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Pierre, you had a slightly different focus, I guess, in terms of looking at the response and adaptation to climate change, and look forward to your comments.
Yes, thank you. And very quickly, we had session 5 entitled Response and Adaptation to Climate Change. We had a very lively debate with political leaders from the region, in particular the Honourable Prime Minister from Tuvalu and the Vice President of Kiribati in the room. We had also representative of organisation providing climate finance, and of course the Green Fund was very much a subject of discussion and exchanges. Implementing agencies also in the region, development partners, private sector. We had a very good exchange. The session really tried to reconnect our debate to the global agendas which form the framework in which we are all operating. In particular, as far as climate is concerned, the result of the Paris Agreement, the COP21, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda for 2030, which should be the basis for everything we do in terms of cooperation with countries in the region. The great contribution that the Pacific region, and in particular the seeds in this region, has made to the shaping up of this global agenda needs to be acknowledged. We owe them the 1.5 degree. We owe them the binding nature of this agreement. We owe them also this great focus put on what will come now in the future, that is a robust and regular reporting on achievements, on results. And we know we owe them many other things that I'm not going to list here, but the specific needs and of the seeds was really acknowledged and has been embedded into this global agenda. Climate finance, of course, has attracted a lot of attention. There again, the link with the Pacific and with the needs of the seeds was very much acknowledged. The next meeting will take place in Apia, in Samoa. So this is also something very important. The famous Samoa pathway was also mentioned and is still very much a reference point for all of us. We discussed the process of the GCF, discussed the role of implementing agencies. Are they too many? How are they accredited? Should we have better coordination of donors? This was also a subject of a few exchanges. There was a call definitely for having as many projects put in the pipeline, submitted to the fund, with the vision of thinking laterally. I think this is the word that was used, meaning that we should look at projects that can be upscaled, that experiences, results that can be replicated at regional level or multi-country level. Now, we also looked at other aspects of climate change, and in particular the fact that as much as energy is a fundamental sector in meeting the ambitions of COP21, there are other sectors that are immensely impacted. We should certainly not forget that SDG 2 says that we should look at sustainable agriculture, food security, and nutrition as global objectives for sustainable development. And agriculture was discussed, and in particular, it's linked to the need to make it climate friendly, that we need to change our agriculture to make it compatible with the change of climate, and their innovation and research being extremely, extremely important and needing all the support that we can get. We also discussed transport and in particular the initiative taken by the region, the leadership of the Marshall Islands, to take the subject of emissions in the transport sector to the IMO. This dates back to 2015, and after a long process where, in fact, the region was also able to gather support, in particular from important European member states. This is now acknowledged by the IMO as a subject that needs to be discussed formally in these proceedings. I don't think that we will contemplate a very quick solution on these issues, in particular in the IMO, but at least the process and the path is now open for something that we should all follow with great attention. There, of course, innovation, research also needs to play a fundamental role, and I would like to also acknowledge the fact that it is for the region such a sensitive issue that taking leadership in this is also remarkable for all of us. We were also presented the particular needs of the seeds, in particular of Kiribati, in areas such as WASH, water and sanitation, and the management of waste, which is a very, very important issue running through many islands there. I heard it already by my fellow facilitators here, the important fundamental role of communities in all this, whether energy, whether the rest, has been underlined over and over again, and I think that this should be a big takeaway for this conference. Finally, I would like to indicate that the concluding words were provided to us by the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, where he said that it's no longer a donor-recipient agenda. It is a global, universal agenda. It's binding us all with obligations and opportunities for all of us, and this is the way I think that we should definitely try to approach it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. As I mentioned, there are a number of donors who wanted to make a statement, and while we were going to take microphones around the room, I think it'd be more appropriate perhaps if I invited each of you in turn. So just to forewarn you, if I could, that expecting a presentation from the Asian Development Bank, then from the Australian High Commissioner, from the European Investment Bank, from JICA, from Mazda, and then from the World Bank Group. And I'd like to invite Jim Lynch, if he's here, to come forward and make his presentation, please.
Well, good afternoon, and on behalf of the Asian Development Bank, I'd really like to begin by thanking the Government of New Zealand as well as the European Union for organizing this really important Pacific Energy Conference here in Auckland. I think really over the past few years, and particularly since the Pacific Energy Summit back in 2013, we've really seen incredible progress in the energy sector across the Pacific. But notwithstanding this progress, improving access to affordable and sustainable energy in the region remains a formidable challenge. Because improved access to more affordable energy yields tremendous development benefits, energy is really clearly a priority sector for ADB's operations in the Pacific. ADB is currently implementing 14 renewable energy and energy efficiency projects in 8 Pacific countries, and these projects are valued at more than $350 million US. In the coming years, we really anticipate a significant expansion in our investment in the energy sector throughout the region. Just over the next 4 years, as an example, we plan to invest more than $300 million US in new renewable energy and energy efficiency projects as prioritized by our developing member countries in the Pacific. These investments will be for 13 projects across 9 Pacific countries. However, a sustainable energy future for the Pacific is not simply a matter of projects. Sustainable energy future also requires continued progress on important energy sector reforms. So in parallel with our project investments, ADB will continue to support tariff and utility reforms, modern energy regulations, institutional capacity building, as well as the implementation of key policies across the energy sector. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's fair to say that the energy future for the Pacific looks brighter than ever before. But all of us, namely multilateral development banks, bilateral donors, and the Pacific Island countries, need to work together to achieve the ambitious targets we have set for 2024. And it goes without saying that ADB looks forward to partnering with all of you in these efforts. Thank you very much.
I'd like to call on Peter Woolacott from the Australian High Commission, please.
Thank you very much, and can I be very brief on this? I'm keeping the Minister from speaking. But can I thank the New Zealand Government and the European Commission for calling what I think has been a very useful and important conference. Just to say a few words on behalf of the Australian Government, I'd just like to say that we realise that energy is the lifeblood of economic activity, and that the expanding energy access to communities and businesses was going to be critical to the future prosperity and resilience of the Pacific. So the Australian aid program very much factors in a solid portfolio of work related to energy in the Pacific. We're currently spending some $41 million in energy projects across the Pacific, and that's focused on national planning, it's focused on implementation and energy efficiency activities, and also on the strengthening of resilience for energy supplies in the Pacific. Now the highlights, now again I'll be very quick. Really there's a solar grid project in Kiribati of some $3.2 million. There is a $9 million project in Samoa which relates to to the expansion of the energy power system. And there's also the Tina hydropower project in the Solomon Islands, which will be the first, that's also a $9 million project done with a PPP, which will be the first hydropower project for 40 years in the Pacific, and feeds very much into increasing private sector investment with that in mind. So the audience will appreciate that the Australian government is in caretaker mode at the moment. We're in sort of heightened election fever. So I'm limited to what I can say about future plans, but two things are very clear. The first is the Australian government is committed, and it committed itself in Paris at COP21, to providing $1 billion over the next 5 years for climate finance. Now, a significant portion of that will be spent in the Pacific, and will be guided very much in that by Pacific priorities. And we also acknowledge that renewable energy is very much part of that process. And I would commend the thought to you that you should look at your NDCs almost as investment plans going forward into the future. And the second part that the Australian government is firmly committed to is supporting efforts under China's G20 presidency to expand G20 collaboration on energy access to include the Pacific region. And Australia is especially encouraging the G20 to look at the energy situation in Papua New Guinea and small island developing states of the Pacific, and to also focus on the resilience issue as well. So look, I thank you very much, and thank you for really what I think has been an excellent day's conference on a very important issue.
I'd like to invite Adam Brun from the EIB to the podium, please.
Good afternoon. I too would like to thank both the New Zealand government and also the European Union for hosting and organizing this fantastic event. The European Investment Bank, we are a big global player in climate action. We've committed, as I've already said on several occasions, last year some 26 billion US dollars in favor of climate action, and we intend to scale that up quite significantly by an additional 10 billion US dollars equivalent in the coming years. However, in the Pacific region, we remain, and intentionally so, to be a small player. And we do, although we are a small player in the Pacific, we have large ambitions of imparting our experience and knowledge that we've built up from both the inside the EU and also from other developing countries. So we hope to bring that to bear in the Pacific. Currently, we are working on renewable energy projects in Tonga, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and Fiji. And we look forward in the coming years to working together with our partner governments and also our donor partners. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Fuyuki Sugara to the podium, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. JICA, as an implementing agency of ODA assistance by Government of Japan, we have collaborated energy sector in PIC countries for a long time. And in addition to that, last year, the Government of Japan hosted the 7th Pacific Island Leaders Meeting, and under one of that cooperation package, JICA will promote a hybrid island program. In this program, we will collaborate closely with the PRC developing countries to seek optimal hybrid grid system, aiming the reduction of fossil fuel consumption for energy security of those countries, as well as contributing to reduction of greenhouse gas. And under this program, we will like proceed with various technical cooperations and other projects. In planning and the implementation of this, those technical cooperations or grant rates, we would like to promote and utilize Japan's technology and expertise on hybrid grid system. Particularly, as you know, Japan is also an island country, and there are some remote island areas, especially like Okinawa area. We like to utilize this kind of their expertise. Maybe this expertise will be applicable for PIC countries. So through these collaboration, we would like to enhance our partnership with PIC countries under this program. Once again, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Thank you.
I'd like to give an opportunity to Mr. Olabode Isan from Mazda to speak, please. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Mazda is from the United Arab Emirates.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Mike Allen. Thank you to our host, the New Zealand government and the European Union, for the opportunity to reconvene here and take part in the conference. We're very grateful for this opportunity. For the UAE and the renewable energy vehicle, Mazda, 2013 marked a very special occasion. It was a turning point for us in the Pacific. Here in Auckland, we announced the $50 million grant fund, the UAE Pacific Partnership Fund, an initiative of our Foreign Minister, His Highness Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, to rapidly scale up the deployment of renewable energy across the region. Today, we're very pleased to announce that under the fund, we have commissioned and deployed very diverse and very highly impactful renewable energy projects in 11 Pacific countries, Pacific island countries. To briefly recap, the projects funded commenced with a solar PV project in Tonga, followed by Samoa's first wind farm and outer island projects in Fiji, and then PV projects in Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. The next cycle, with inaugurations just a few weeks ago, included projects in Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Nauru, as well as centralized hybrid plants and solar water treatment projects in Palau and the Solomon Islands, which was co-funded by New Zealand as well. In total, these projects have resulted in deployment of 6.5 megawatts of renewable energy, which will displace an estimated amount of about 3.2 million liters of diesel fuel every year. And this will avoid the emission of up to 8,400 tons of CO2 every year. Our involvement in the Pacific will not come to an end with the completion of these projects. Today, again, we're very pleased to announce that in consultation with the government and regional partners, the UAE, through Mazda, will support a capacity building program in the Pacific for renewable energy. Our hope is that the program can make a contribution to all the Pacific Island countries' renewable energy ambitions and cover a range of topics that support and enhance the deployment of renewable energy commercially in the region. It's been a stellar 3 years, and we very much look forward to working with all our partners and stakeholders in the next stage of the industry. Thank you.
Now I'd like to call on Stephanie Stahlmeister to join us, please.
I would like to thank the organizers, the New Zealand government and the European Union for organizing this conference and for hosting this amazing event. Thank you. The World Bank Group remains committed to support its shareholders in reaching its renewable energy targets in the Pacific. To this effect, the World Bank has tripled its investment in technical assistance and advisory services in the energy sector from 25 million to 80 million, exceeding its 2013 commitment target by $30 million US. Building on this engagement, the World Bank Group is programming a further 340 million to significantly increase access to reliable and sustainable energy in the Pacific. The World Bank Group has projects planned to support expansion of transmission and distribution lines, as well as developing of micro and mini grids in remote and off-grid locations, and identification of least cost generation options. Through the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank Group has continued its commitment to enabling private sector investment and innovative partnerships in the energy sector across the Pacific. The IFC is now pursuing interventions from early stage project development risk participation to equity and debt financing private sector participation. The IFC is aiming to directly facilitate and mobilize in excess of $500 million of private sector investment to the energy sector. The IFC is also aims to open our Pacific markets to new opportunities via the IFC's advisory services, thanks to our key development partners, Australia and New Zealand. And we're looking forward to continue our cooperation with our shareholders and development partners in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were the list that I had. Are there any other donors who would like to take the opportunity to make a brief statement? I'm sorry, Minister, there aren't. In that case, I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking the facilitators for their efforts. I think it's been a very successful day. We've had the opportunity to look back on the success over the last few years, which has been significant, but also to readdress some of the challenges we have ahead. So I'd ask you to thank the facilitators and look forward to seeing you shortly in the drinks and the dinner. Thank you.